Hello, and welcome to our lecture focusing on the designer as explorer. The subject of our talk is going to be on design thinking. Now, the first question is, what is it? And how is it any different from what you've been learning so far? To kind of give a great overview is design thinking is the confidence that new, better things are possible, and you as a designer can make it happen. There's a certain belief into the future. We're not reactionary. We're not necessarily creating one more advertisement, one more packaging that the client needs. We're anticipating the needs of the many for tomorrow. So design thinking encourages creative consideration of a wide range of innovative solutions. As you saw in the video, the interview with Tim Brown, you get to see that it's looking at the role design can play in a completely new way. We do design everything you see. You wouldn't be able to drive to the store without someone having designed traffic signs for you. Well, this is our time that design can actually start looking at how it can benefit society. It can be applied to any field or market. We don't necessarily have to stay in the realm we've always created in. And it approaches challenges from the point of the end user. So even though we've focused on research, this is where it really comes into play, because it's focusing on the idea that there's a human on the other side of what you create. As designers, we have a bit of a pitfall. We think our entire world is the computer in which we create. We have no concept that what we create on the outside of our computer is going to be used by someone else. And design thinking focuses on this user and thinks of what they need instead of us necessarily prescribing to them. And it calls for a deep understanding of the user's unmet needs. It means that you're going to look at how they live and interact in their world and what you can create to make the world better for them. But first, a little bit of a history lesson. Design thinking, even though this is somewhat of a new term, is nothing new in the inventor area. And who you're looking at is a picture of Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison, among many inventions, is credited with creating the phonograph. But the problem is that that's not exactly what he set out to create. He, with the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, was actually trying to create what became an answering machine. He worked with many different types of materials to create the record, or what would be recording the voice of the person who would call. What he got to see is that it opened up a completely new area for design, in fact, and you can credit Edison for the way you listen to music today, because he saw that the answering machine was somewhat of a gimmick. So he decided to record voices of local singers and opera companies onto record to show the benefits it could be. And so that's why he created one of the first record labels, which led to the music industry as we know it today. So all of that would not have been created if it wasn't necessarily looking at what the users need instead of prescribing what they necessarily want. So the mindset of design thinking is that it's more human-centered and empathic. We're not necessarily telling people what they need. We're showing them or reflecting their lives and what they need to have to make their lives easier. It's biased towards action. There's not a lot of time planning. There's a lot of time researching, creating, getting feedback on the design, and then recreating if it has to be. It's much more collaborative. There isn't a designer working alone in a cubicle coming up with solutions. This is about a team-based solution. And of course, multiple solutions. We have to come to terms that the first thing we create isn't necessarily what needs to be created. And it's the idea of getting that prototype tested, market research we sometimes call it, and see if this is more viable as a solution. If not, back to the drawing board. making changes, making tweaks to the design until it's authentic to what the user needs. The mindset is a lot more of show, don't tell. Instead of talking about what's going to happen, it's showing what's going to happen. And it's about embracing the process. You get to see that the production time is very, very small compared to the work you do ahead of time. And while working in the industry before I became an instructor, we would spend as much as a year in pre-production and research into covers and trends and possible design directions we would take, and then about a month in production to show you the overall importance of it. Because the whole idea is if you have really great plans, if you have a wonderful blueprint for what you're creating, you're prepared for anything that the production process might throw your way. But if you jump directly into production, then there's issues that come up that you might not have planned for, and that takes you lots longer than to complete your design. So design thinking is at the intersection between analytical thinking, being research driven, but also intuitive thinking. You are a designer, and we are wanting you to see with your intuition what you think something needs to be, but it does need to be backed up by the research. So to compare the two, traditional design says, what is the right answer? Design thinking is all about asking the right question, getting to your audience and figuring out exactly what they need. If you're creating an ad campaign, for instance, sometimes the very first thing to do is create a magazine ad. But maybe this is not the best place to reach your audience. And so this is what design thinking does. It looks at your audience along the purchase cycle and thinks about where it's the best time to get in front of them for the optimal impact of what you're creating. The traditional design, repeatable, proven processes. It gets into a rut. You see it all the time in Hollywood. There'll be one breakout movie and then there's two or three. And the same formula comes immediately after it. Design thinking is more about being intuitive and responsive and thinking of what's needed in the exact moment. Traditional design, you design for something. There's a lot of us telling the customer what they need instead of necessarily asking them, which is what design thinking is. It's much more collaborative. You design with your audience in mind, with your customer in mind. You build for insight, and that's where the prototyping process is. And so, again, going back to the idea of the ad campaign, come up with your ideas and then go out among the public, ask people, what do they think about it? And believe it or not, asking people who are not very savvy in design is probably one of the best things that you will want to do. Because if they understand what you're trying to say, then the designers, the ones that are giving you the feedback and the grades, and it pleases them as well. So it's about listening, not talking. It's about getting outside and being part of the world. We don't represent everyone. None of us are particular. There are patterns in human behavior, but no one is exactly like us. So sometimes you have to get out and meet the type of person that will be using your product or see in your ad to see how to create, which is most authentic to them. Design thinking is more about the story and less about the data, more about the experience and less about the event. You're talking about feelings and not necessarily facts. So people get involved with the story. Movies, for instance, of some of the most memorable movies across the years have been those with really good storylines. And movies that focus on the effects and the car chases, they're great for a time, but they don't necessarily stand the test of time because there's not a foundation behind them. And of course, it's more collaborative, as mentioned, and less siloed. We want to be revolutionary and inspired with our design thinking. So if you want to start brainstorming in the design thinking process, and this is a way you can go about it, One of the things you recommend when you're wanting to brainstorm in the design thinking format is to think like a child. And I know that sounds almost cliche, but I'll explain why. A child isn't necessarily thinking and judging every decision that's being made. They're just creating. And we want you to get into that mindset too. Record multiple ideas. Don't worry about judging at this stage, because in the very end, what's going to be your final solution many times is a combination of multiple ideas. Now, when you hit on that idea, it might be brainstorming number 58. It might be number 3. You might end up with the very first thing you designed. But I will tell you, in my history, that has never ever happened, that the first thing I created was the final of how it turned out. And many people would suggest that the very first design is the one that's most cliche, that's the most stereotypical, and that's the one you want to move away from first. So in thinking like a child, you want to defer judgment, no blocking your ideas. Just record them down. It's not costing you anything to write down an idea that may or may not work. It's important to know what isn't successful as much as what is. You have to investigate all possibilities. And in fact, the wilder the idea, the more outside of the box thinking, the better it will be for you. That's how, number one, you create work that's memorable. It's number two, how you break yourself out of stagnation in what you create. And that's how you revolutionize. Of course, you want to stay on topic. It's easy to get off onto a tangent. It's about quantity over quality at this point. We want to get as many ideas as possible, but one at a time. And that is a very important bullet point, because most people go directly to the computer first with any type of project that they have to create. And that's why we suggest using a sketchbook or paper of some kind, because something happens when you go to the computer that all of a sudden the solution that you come up with the very first time is the one that you stick with, because you get more involved in the technology and how to make it work than just recording your idea. Be visual. Again, if you have to depend on too much text to explain what your solution's about, then you've not communicated. And you want to build on the ideas of others. That's where the collaboration comes from. And I can honestly tell you it's something to embrace, because a lot of projects that I've been involved in, bouncing ideas off other people, have actually taken the project to places I never would have thought of. The collaboration is greater than the sum of the parts. And once you understand people and have the back and forth, you'll be able to get these leaps in design that you wouldn't have had otherwise if you were stuck in your own ideas. So the steps in the design thinking process are 3 phases. You have your strategy, interaction design, and interface design. Your strategy is what's considered pre-production, your research. This is where you have to define what is the problem in the first place. That's the first thing to start. And the reason the project exists isn't because you were assigned it or a client hired you to do it. You have to know what role it plays. And that's the best thing that you can learn from the very beginning, because if you don't have a firm grasp on that, everything will be hard after that point. You have to be able to wrap your head around that concept at the very beginning. But during this is where you do your research. You get out and you look at the people who will be using your product or whatever you're creating and see what their life is like. What do they do? What do they eat? What are their habits? Next, you start designing for interaction. And this is obviously, you hear it sometimes as user interaction or UI when in terms of websites and such. But this is how you expect someone to interact with what you create. And that includes the ideas that you bounce off and the creation of the prototype. And then you create the interface or the actual product itself. And you will go back and forth between building a prototype, having it analyzed, or market research, to use it however term you want to, getting feedback, whether it's critique from an instructor or your client or the user. That will go back to within these phases within your design iteration. So as I mentioned, your step one is defining the client. Identify, visualize who your audience is. A lot of people actually assign a personality. They will come up with a profile of a person they are trying to reach. And this becomes a bar that you can always reach for. Then once you have your data of your user, you start identifying what their core need is, coming up with different ideas and solutions. You start building your prototype, and this comes from brainstorm based on your research, and then get feedback. Now, the unmentioned step in there is the evolution, meaning that you change. Sometimes people don't know what they want until they see it, and so that might spark more ideas by what you create, and that's an essential part of the process as well. And to give you an example, exactly what I mean, and we can walk through this process together because I know it's very different. So let's pretend that we are assigned that we're going to design an app for the average college student to help organize his or her life. And the way you figure out about what they need is you start examining their life. So let's just say this is the desktop of the average student, which drives my OCD crazy. But let's just pretend by looking at this gives us all the clues we need about the structure. So the first thing you'll want to do is define the problem. You also want to get to the idea of what they want to have to be the outcome. So ask questions. What is their life like? Why is the desktop so disorganized? Is there lack of time in between classes? Is there not enough between, having to juggle a family and work and school that, as much organization as you'd like to have, it's just not possible? And these are the kind of questions you have. You can't make assumptions based on how you act in your own life about how others will react too. So once you ask all the questions about what would benefit them the most, you move into your ideation stage. And that's when you start inventorying the possible needs. So in this case, we're going to say student A is trying to organize their life, become more efficient, because they want to feel a certain way. You have to remember that at the very end of everything you create, you're eliciting a feeling. You're giving them a change, an evolution to move from a state of, in this case, disorganization into organization. So organization makes them feel like a good student, a successful student, smart, accepted. Start thinking of what all these words will be, and this fills out your formula here. So that's how you develop your problem statement. Student A needs a way to organize their life in a way that makes them feel smart, efficient. So then you start brainstorming possible solutions based on that. Now, what we got to see is that there isn't a lot of organization. So what if it was a desktop app that actually organized according to project, so that it cleaned up the desktop for you intuitively? What if it was something that enabled you to design your time? There's already alarm apps, but what if we had an alarm app that reacted to the traffic patterns around you and knowing where you need to go at 9 a.m., but knowing there's an accident, so maybe it wakes you up 15 minutes early so you're not late for work. And so you start to see, how these kind of solutions can come forward just by examining someone's life. And then you have to ask the questions once you've created it. Number one, the app that we described, would you find it useful? Would you be willing to download and install it? There's some people that they say yes, they'll think it's be great, but would they download it? Unless it came from a recognized, trusted vendor, maybe not. And how much would you be willing to pay for it? Some people don't pay for apps at all. Everything has to be free. And then, of course, we ask what other questions you should ask. And this is the part of what design thinking is. This is the interaction, and it all comes from asking questions. And that's what the explorer does. That's what the designer as an explorer does. So thank you for your time, and we'll talk again soon.